Okay, so I have started to notice a trend on this channel. I make a video about one of the most interesting bombers of the Second World War, and you guys sleep. I make a video about one of the most insane weapon programs I have ever heard about. You guys are not interested.
Don't care, still don't care.
I make a video about a small German World War II tractor and success. But I have some bad news. The Second World War ended in 1945. And with that, all the funny tanks stopped as well. Meaning the content that I can make that you guys like is quite limited. However, what if I tell you that the Second World War was not the end of combat operations of the funny German tanks, with some of them seeing combat until 1967? So for this story, we sadly have to start in France.
What kind of place is this?
After the Second World War, the French found themselves in possession of a large number of World War II tanks that were captured. The French did have some interest in certain models, like the Panther, which they used for 2 post-war French regiments until 1950. However, most of the tanks that were captured were seen as outdated or, just not worth the hassle, with most of these ending up in storage. However, in the 1950s, these tanks all of a sudden found a new home. You see, after the Israeli War of Independence, the French tried to stay on good terms with both Israel and Syria. To do that, they engaged in what they would call balanced weapon sales, giving each country an opportunity to buy certain gear in the hope that the other country won't get too pissed off. One of the things that the French offered to the Syrian army were these mothballed World War II German tanks that were sitting around in a warehouse somewhere. Now, you might assume that they were talking about the Panther tank that the French army stopped using around the same time as this cell. Which would make sense. By the 1950s these tanks were already seen as outdated and would probably not have caused any diplomatic tensions. Well, sadly for the Syrian army, they didn't even get the option to buy these tanks. Instead being offered Panzer IVs, StuG IIIs, Jagdpanzer IVs and some Hummels. Now I know that my audience is probably familiar with most of these tanks. However, to gain more watch time, let's quickly go over these vehicles. Now first we have the Panzer IV, which was Germany's wartime workhorse. It started development all the way back in 1934, with the first versions rolling off the production line in 1937. Throughout the war the Panzer IV was upgraded many times, and at least somewhat luckily for the Syrian army, all the Panzer IVs that were sold to them were at least the later models, the so-called longer barreled versions, with the Rheinmetall KWK 40 gun, which could, at least on paper, take out an M4 Sherman at a range of around 1000 yards, at least under ideal circumstances. Now I do hear you say, hey dipshit, why don't you just give us the Ausführung or the version that was sold, instead of giving a vague description of the gun? Well, first of all, that is very rude and you don't need to use that kind of language. And second of all, it is very hard to say which version was sold to them. It's most likely the Ausführung J, however it's probably best to describe these tanks as Frankensteins, seeming that most of them were repaired and put together with parts that were just laying around. No matter the case, the Panzer IV by the 1950s was heavily outdated. Hell, it was already outdated around the end of the Second World War. The Panzer IV was first considered outdated by German High Command in late 1943 to early 1944, with the tank struggling against then modern tanks like the T-34 and the IS-2. Still, the Syrian army decided to purchase 40 of these tanks. Next we have the StuG III, which was at least somewhat less outdated. The Syrians received probably the Ausführung J or the Ausführung F version, which had the 75mm StuG 40 gun. And at the very least, German command never saw the StuG III as outdated during the war. So you might see the 9 StuG IIIs that the Syrian army bought a little bit more of a logical purchase, but we'll get back to the StuG III. Next up is the Hummel, or the Bumblebee when you translate it to German, which is a self-propelled artillery piece. Its main weapon was a 150mm SFH-18 howitzer, which was gonna pose some problems. Well, the whole Syria receiving Hummels is a bit of a confusing problem in itself. So first of all, they received 5 Hummels from France. Now, one thing that was not included in the sale was the support vehicles that was supposed to hold the shells of the Hummel, which was a bit essential, seeming that the vehicle could only hold 18 rounds. However, in a way, this didn't matter that much because they didn't have many rounds for this thing anyway. Because the only ammunition that they got for this tank were the shells that the French army captured during the Second World War. Apparently, later on, the Soviets made some post-war shells that could be fired from the Hummel, which seems like a lot of headache for just 5 vehicles. Anyway, moving on to the last and final vehicle, which is the Jagdpanzer IV. They received 6 of them, and the Jagdpanzer IV has some really interesting development history. And man, I just wish that somebody would make a video about this tank, so that I don't have to explain that much. I said I wish that somebody would...
Hi there, I'm Enigma, and I've been asked by a friend here, Zwalada, I hope I pronounced that right, for my amazing insights on the Jagdpanzer IV, God's perfect casemate, apart from the parts where it wasn't. But anyways, now, the video he needs my help with, because we all know he needs my help,
the last time that the German World War II tank was used.
So as you'd think, the Jagdpanzer IV was based on the Panzer IV, and you'd be correct in thinking that. To be more specific, it was based on the best Panzer IV, the H. Its main aim was to be a development from the StuG IIIs, mainly the addition of the 7.5cm L70 gun from the Panther. However, this project did in fact not start with the Panzer IV. Development on this tank started with a very creative, we'll say that, very unique even, wooden mock-up based on the StuG IIIs in a very large, very Hetzer-style upper superstructure. However, this was quickly found that it was not feasible. Just like, look at that guy. It was then later decided that they should mount it on the Panzer IV, which was a very good idea. So Eklet went and produced a scale model that they said could mount either the 7.5cm L70 cannon or a 10.5cm cannon. I think that's technically a howitzer. This model was presented to Hitler, and since the paper trail goes cold there, I'd imagine he forgot about it or something. Now hearing this, you'd be thinking, but if Hitler forgot, why is there a Jagdpanzer? Why does this special award-seeking cameo ever exist? Shush, 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 shush. We'll get to it in due time. Womack produced their own copied homework idea of a 7.5cm cannon based on the Panzer IV chassis. Now this sounds awfully familiar, doesn't it? However, they changed it, by this time mounting it on the F. They made ordered mock-up to show Hitler in May 1943, and Hitler didn't forget about it this time. He ordered production of several prototypes of the tank. Womack made it incredibly sexy. Oh, it's perfect. Soft steel mock-up of the design. But it's the only thing that's soft here. And then they ruined it by making the mainline production one. This tank had its haters during its time, specifically Heinz Guderian, who wrongly thought that the Jagdpanzer IV was an imperfect replacement for, in his eyes, the StuG IIIs, as he thought it was adequate enough and that they should make the Panzer IV instead of the Jagdpanzer IV. I would ask if you thought he was right, but I'm not entertaining that wrong idea. How does one end a cameo?
Thank you, Enigma, for your insight. Make sure to go check out his channel. I can highly recommend his video on the Italian Mayas. It's one of my favorite videos of his. And if you want to learn more about the Jagdpanzer IV, then go check out this video about that tank as well. Now, you might have noticed one thing of all of these tanks. They were outdated by the 1950s. Now, you would assume that the Syrian army that bought these heavily outdated tanks would at least make some effort to modernize these tanks and just get some more use out of them. However, that is not what happened. Instead, the Syrian army spent their very limited tank budget on acquiring even more Panzer IVs and StuG IIIs. With them buying additional Panzer IVs and StuG IIIs from Czechoslovakia in 1955. Now, the Czechoslovak army did use these tanks, however, they already retired these two models in November 1943. So probably for them, this was a great opportunity to get rid of some old shit and make some money. In fact, they charged a pretty hefty price for these outdated old tanks.
$101 for a
Panzer.
with cheese, Mr. Squidward. With cheese.
4,500 pounds for a Panzer IV, being around $140,000 in today's money, and 3,250 pounds for a StuG III, which is around $100,000 in today's money. Now, you would think that after 1955, that's it. There's no more World War II relics that the Syrian army is buying to fill up their army. You're wrong. More Panzer IVs and StuG IIIs were bought from Spain in December 1965. Also, there was a single StuG III that was bought from Romania. Just thought I would mention that as well. Okay, so Syria actually used these tanks in battle. So the first time the Syrian army used these World War II tanks was during the Water War, which is not really considered a war, more a series of skirmishes between Israel and Syria. So in 1964, Syria placed a handful of these Panzer IVs on the western slope of the Golan Heights, almost directly at the border of Israel, and they used these tanks to fire on Israeli farmers. Around this same time, Syria announced that they were planning on diverting 35% of the Jordan River away from Israel to deprive the country of drinking water. Israel warned that this would be considered an act of war and followed through by firing on construction crews with snipers and artillery. Okay, moving back to the tanks. So in 1965, there was a quick World War II reenactment between Syria and Israel, with Israeli Shermans exchanging shots with the Syrian Panzers. However, nothing really came from this. Around that time, the UN had to step in to cool things down, telling both sides to just basically back off. But neither side had much respect for the UN peacekeepers, which is nice to see that nothing changed in all of these years. Both sides just basically saw it as a quick break to get ready for the next round. And when the truce ended, the Syrians brought back the Panzer IVs. But this time the Israelis were ready, with Centurion tanks already in place. These British-built Cold War tanks had better armor, optics and firepower than anything that the Panzer IV had, with the results being quite predictable. Two Panzer IVs got destroyed almost immediately, and the rest were abandoned. The next time that the German World War II tanks were used was during the 6-Day War. Now, by the time that the 6-Day War kicked off in 1967, Syria still had supposedly a number of German World War II tanks in service. So let's start with the StuG III. Syria had around 24 of these ready for action, with maybe another 12 in very bad shape that was mainly used for spare parts. Now, the Israelis found most of them dug into the Golan Heights, with some of them being even buried as a makeshift pillbox or bunker. Now, if you are somewhat familiar with the StuG III or ever saw a picture of the StuG III, you might see a teeny tiny little problem with using these things as makeshift bunkers. Yeah, you cannot rotate the gun, making them very easy targets. You just don't go in front of them. 3 StuGs were confirmed destroyed by the Israeli army, and 1 was captured in working condition and taken back as a war trophy. Most of the rest of these tanks were probably blown up by their own crews and abandoned when Syria was starting to lose ground. After that, the StuG III just disappeared from Syrian records, never to be mentioned again. So next we had the Hummels, the self-propelled artillery piece. Syria probably had all 5 of them still at the start of the 6-Day War, but they didn't even fire a single shot. Now this could be that they were either broken at the start of the war, they were wiped out by Israeli counter batteries before they could even show up, or they just weren't used. And just like the StuG, the Syrians never talked about these tanks ever again. But we will come back to the Hummels in just 1 minute. Now for the Jagdpanzer IV, at least on paper, Syria still had all 6 of them in operation at the start of the war. For what we can see on pictures is that at least 1 of them was dug in as a makeshift pillbox. And this one got destroyed during combat. Now if you look good on this picture, you can see that it got a direct hit on the frontal armor, which was supposed to be the best protected part of this tank. But strangely enough, the other 5 were still kept in storage after the war. And in fact, we do have some more information about these tanks. In the early 1990s, it was noted on some documents from the Syrian army that these tanks were stored somewhere in a warehouse in Syria. Now, after that information came out, there were some attempts to buy these tanks to display in museums, but sadly nothing ever came of it. Most likely these tanks were scrapped during the early 2000s or destroyed during the Syrian Civil War. However, this still means that there is a small chance that there is a warehouse somewhere in Syria that has 4 really rare Jagdpanzer IVs just standing there waiting for somebody to pick them up. Finally, we have the Panzer IV. Syria had around 25 fully working ones in 1967, plus maybe 10 more in various states of kind of working. Most of the French ones were at that time out of service, but the ex-Spanish and the ex-Czech ones were still operational. Now, during the war, at least 10 of these Panzer IVs were destroyed by Israeli tanks or aircraft. The last confirmed kill was on June 10, when one of these tanks got knocked out by a modified Israeli M50 Super Sherman, which completely outclassed the old Panzer IVs in every single way. 4 Syrian Panzer IVs were captured intact and were put on display in Israel. 2 of those that were captured were badly damaged but not completely destroyed, so the Israelis dragged them back and used them for ammo testing. Now, after the 6-day war, whatever Panzer IV Syria had left were in bad shape, either mechanical or worse, so just like the StuGs and the Hummels, Syria never talked about them again. Now, despite all the effort that the Syrians did with these World War II German tanks, they didn't knock out a single Israeli tank, proving that these tanks were no longer useful on the modern battlefield. Now, this was probably the last time that these tanks were used. Notice how I say probably there. So you know what that means. Time to look at some nonsense which is probably not even true. Okay, so the Hummels, they were missing during the 6-day war, but they might have been used later. So the Hummel might have been used, and I say might with big asterisks, in the Syrian Civil War. So, like I said before, only a limited amount of German captured ammo was provided by the French when the Hummels were sold. However, the Soviets produced rounds that could be used in the Hummel and were sold to Syria. During the Syrian Civil War, these very specific rounds were found to be fired. However, most likely they were fired in an improvised way. But this means that there is a very small chance that these rounds were actually fired by the Hummel, a World War II vehicle that was used all the way up till 2014 till 2016. Also, most of the tanks that were destroyed in 1967 are still out there and just rotting away. Now, I hear you think, and yes, these tanks will look great in your garden. However, you're probably not going to be able to recover them, seeming that the area is still heavily mined. Anyway, that is all that I have about these tanks. Thank you for watching to the end, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.